So welcome to all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. It's a pleasure to be here today for this keynote. The keynote is by Galit Shmueli from Taiwan. And I'm Pierre Pinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Forecasting. And this keynote is the editor's pick. So it's a pleasure for me to have Galit here today. I'm going to give an introduction to Galit and her talk, but before, I would like to mention that you should post your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. And then for the question session, what we'll do is that I will read the questions from the Q&A. And if you would like to ask the question live, you have to raise your hand. It's a bit more management because then Taz will have to unmute you so that you can ask your question. So I think it's better to use the Q&A box, but if you prefer to ask your question live, I'm sure we'll make it work. So let me introduce Galit. Galit Shmueli is a Tsinghua Distinguished Professor and Institute Director at the Institute of Service Science at National Tsinghua University in Taiwan. She's an acclaimed researcher and educator, having won multiple research and teaching awards, and also her online teaching videos on YouTube are highly subscribed. Galit is the inaugural editor-in-chief of the Informed Journal of Data Science and has served on editorial boards of top journals in statistics and information systems. She's an IMS fellow and an ISI elected member. Her research focuses on statistical and data mining methodology with applications in information systems, healthcare, and an emphasis on human behavior. Galit Shmueli will now give a talk on improving prediction of human behavior using behavior modification. Galit, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very delighted to be invited to give this talk. Thank you, Pierre, and thank you to the organizers, Cass and George. So this talk is not going to be about forecasting, but it's definitely going to be about prediction. And I hope that it gives all the forecasting experts here some interesting ideas. You're probably going to think how this works in your own world. So the key here to the title is the quotes around the word improving. You'll notice that it says improving, quotes unquote, prediction of human behavior using behavior modification. I'm not going to be teaching you how to predict behavior better, but I'm going to show you something quite alarming that might be already happening, maybe inadvertently, by platforms. So I'm going to start with someone that you've probably read his books or have heard him speak, Yuval Noah Harari, who's a famous historian. He's written the books Sapiens and Homo Deus. And in a recent interview, TED interview, he said the following. He said, the ability to hack human beings means the ability to understand humans better than they understand themselves, which means being able to predict their choices, to manipulate their emotions, and to make decisions for them. And the talk today is really going to focus on this combination of prediction and manipulation, which is now becoming pretty common in industry. So I'm going to start with some background. First, I'll just explain a little bit about how and why digital platforms predict user behavior. And then I'll talk about how they modify user behavior, which is something quite different. And then my work comes in, which is combining these two and looking at what happens when you put them together and how might this lead to, quote unquote, improving the predictive power. I'll show you some scenarios. I'll show you why I need new statistical notation to be able to analyze this kind of problem. And after I introduce this notation, I'll show you how I create a new formula that breaks down the expected prediction error. This talk is not going to be extremely technical at all, so everything's going to be pretty visual, but the point is going to be that with this analysis that I'm able to do, I'll be able to uncover several alarming discoveries. Okay, so let me start by talking about behavioral big data, because this is a term I'll be using throughout. You probably all know or heard about what big data is, usually talking about many records, multiple sources of data, very detailed information, very rich data sets at the micro level. And some of you have probably heard of behavioral data, which is people's measurable actions, reactions, interactions, self-reporting, opinions, thoughts, feelings. When you put these two together, you get what's called behavioral big data. And if you think about the data that's available to Facebook, that's behavioral big data. Now, traditional companies have been collecting this behavioral big data for a long time. Financial institutions such as banks or credit scoring, credit agencies, supermarkets and retail, insurance companies, they've been collecting a lot of information about our own behavior, right? When your salary comes into the bank, what you're buying, what kind of insurance you're getting. And they use it to predict our future behavior. And what's new even for them is that now they have much better behavioral big data. So if you think about these companies, now we have a lot of new devices that are recording data that they did not have before. The example you see here is, for example, smart home devices like smart thermostats that measure, the temperatures in different rooms and adjust them according to who's coming in when. If you think about this data has a lot of information about our behavior. When we come home, who lives in which room, who likes what kind of temperatures, and I heard that it can even measure when you're showering. If you go closer to your body and you look into cars, we know that now insurance companies, especially I know in the United States, they use these things called telematic devices, which you plug in a little thing into your car and it measures not only where you're driving, but how you're driving. Maybe you're accelerating too fast when you're taking the turn, or maybe you're backing up too fast or things like that. So now they know also how you're driving. Getting closer to our bodies, if we're wearing any of the smart wearables, like these sneakers or shoes, then not only do they know where we're going and how fast we're going, but they also know maybe we're running together with our partner that's also wearing these kinds of shoes. So we also have information about networks of people that meet together. If we're wearing any of these fitness bands or using smart watches, of course, it has even more information. They know when we're getting notifications and emails coming in. They know when we're typing. They know when we're sleeping. So many things about us that are beyond just the physical being that they purport to measure. And now even kids' behaviors are being recorded, for example, through these smart toys. So when a child is talking to these smart toys and it's recording it, maybe doing translations, and then other people next to this kid are also speaking and interacting with the child or other children, there's a lot of interesting behavioral big data that's now available to these large companies. Why do they collect them? Why do they want to predict the future behavior? Well, for many reasons. One is they want to personalize or improve products or services. Some of them use it to detect fraud. Some use it for advertising, for marketing, or for logistics and operations. But the interesting part is that now it's not only the traditional companies. Now we have the big players that are the digital platforms. And digital platforms, I mean anything from Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, but also a lot of these other platforms that you might be using on a day-to-day basis. You might be using social media. Or you might be using shared economy if you're using Uber or Lyft or using Airbnb. If you're buying on eBay, if you're streaming on Netflix or on Hulu, if you're using online dating sites. So I'm sure all of you are using some kind of social networking. Of course, the platform that this conference is using, Whova, I think, I don't know how to read it out, that is very much a platform that's capturing behavioral big data. If you're using any of the devices that you see here at the top, then obviously you're generating behavioral big data. So it's not only through computers and mobile phones, we also have it through things like Alexas and devices that record our voices. Why do they want to predict our future behavior? For the exact same reasons that the traditional industries want to do it. They want to do it to personalize or improve their products and services. Several of them will say they use it to detect fraud. They use it for advertising. We know that's a #1 business model for many of these companies. Marketing as well, and some are for logistics and operations. Now, to give you a feel of what kind of things are being predicted, here are typical types of behaviors that are predicted by these platforms. So they want to predict the probability that you will purchase something, the probability that someone will leave, churn probabilities. They want to predict how long you're going to spend on the website or on the app, or what's called dwell time. We know that they also want to predict your emotional state. We know that predicting voting behavior is a very useful thing that they're trying to do, and pretty successfully. And we can even predict life events. If you go back a long time ago where Target was collecting data and they could predict what trimester a woman was in her pregnancy, these companies can predict whether you're moving a job, whether you're getting married. It's so easy today, right? Here's an example of a type of tool that Google now sells predictions to advertisers. So it predicts users' behaviors and sells these predictions to advertisers. This thing called suggested audiences, you can see that they're selling things like likely first-time 7-day purchasers or likely 7-day churning purchasers. So within a certain period of time, how likely are you to purchase or churn? I'm going to come back to this example. This is something that's called a prediction product, and I'll get back to it later on. So as statisticians or as machine learning people, when we want to improve predictions, we know that, well, here's what to do. We usually build a predictive model that links a bunch of predictors. Here's the blue circle here to some kind of an outcome. So if I'm talking about cross-sectional data, but of course you can set it up as a time series if you want. And then once you estimate this model f of x, then I can deploy it to new records and then get y hats or get predicted user behavior. Now, of course, my predictions are never exactly correct. So the difference between the predicted user behavior, y hat, and the observed user behavior, y, is going to be what I call the prediction error. And the efforts in statistics and in machine learning is to try and design ways to reduce this prediction error. How can we do that? One is we can build better models, right? So we can improve our f of x's in whatever way. The other thing is we can get better data, and better data is very useful for improving your predictions. And the third thing, especially now if you're doing very heavy computational stuff, is getting better computing infrastructure. And that will also help you improve your predictions. Well, that's exactly what the companies are doing, right? What are platforms doing? They hire lots of data scientists to improve and get better models and better approaches. They purchase a lot of data. So when you hear that Google purchased YouTube or when Facebook purchased WhatsApp, that's why they purchase these companies. A major reason is that they actually have all that data now that makes their predictions much better. And of course, many of these platforms develop their own infrastructure, and we actually even end up buying it from them, right? Using their predictive tools or their cloud hosting or whatever that is. Now, let's stop for a moment to talk about prediction, and let's talk about user behavior modification. Notice that I'm using the word manipulate because that is my personal bias. I think it is totally manipulation. If you prefer, you can call it behavior modification. So these internet platforms use what's called behavior modification techniques together with their behavioral big data. And the goal is to change users' behaviors. What kind of behaviors do they want to change? The same kind of behaviors that they're also predicting, very similar to what we saw before. They want to change the probability that you will purchase something. They want to lower the probability that you will leave. They want to make you stay longer on site. They want to trigger and change your emotional state. And there's a famous Facebook experiment that did that and showing that they can do it. They want to change voting behaviors. Maybe sometimes it's not the platform, but it's someone who's hacking or using the platform. And we know that they can also change our life events. Now, what is behavior modification? Behavior modification comes from psychology. And here's a textbook definition. Behavior modification is an intervention designed to enhance certainty by altering causal processes that regulate behavior. Notice one keyword is enhancing certainty, which means that we're going to modify behavior in a predictable way. But what's special about this is that this is hacking you through your lower brain. So this is usually through things that you're unaware of and you don't typically control. In a book called Hooked by Nir Eyal, he writes that companies must learn not only what compels users to click, but also what makes them tick. Habits are defined as behaviors done with little or no conscious thought. If you think about your phone and when you get a notification, the immediate thing that you'll do is you'll probably look at your phone and then you'll probably click on that notification, which will take you directly to the place that you were intended to go. And whatever is supposed to happen will most likely happen. So a lot of this is happening below our awareness in an automated fashion. Again, behavior modification came out of psychology. It was a whole behaviorist approach to try and improve human life. It was trying to help, whether it's the therapists or even individuals themselves, take hold of their life and kind of hack themselves to improve their life. Later on, the behavioral economists figured that out. So if you read the book Nudge or heard some of that, they figured out, oh, we can use these same techniques to try and drive policy. So we can make some things opt in versus opt out, change policies in that way. And more recently, another team of researchers and academics in a field who grabbed this are the human-computer interaction people. And these are the people who will design and train the people who will create the interfaces for all these apps and websites that we're seeing. So for example, BJ Fogg, a very famous professor at Stanford University, has coined the term persuasive technology, which means when you take these behaviorist types of techniques and integrate them into the digital form, then they're called persuasive technology. And there's a whole host of different techniques, things like tuning and nudging that put subliminal cues in the context, or herding and tunneling that manipulate and engineer the context. If you've ever been to Las Vegas and you've gone gambling, they actually use these kinds of techniques to lead you through carpets that will lead you directly to where you're supposed to be ending up and doing what you're supposed to be doing. Another important type of principle that's from behavioral modification is conditioning or reward schedules. So for example, we know that random reward schedules are much more addictive than if I give you rewards every fixed time. And that's why when you receive your notifications in kind of a random way, that's a lot more addictive. Think about your email coming into your inbox. For me, that's very addictive. Okay, so now we've talked about prediction, and we've talked about behavior modification. And the interesting thing to notice here is that the same platform has both of these capabilities. So now let me show you what happens when you have both of these capabilities, or what can happen. Now, where did all this come from? This whole work that I came up with came from reading a lot of things, which led me to a book by psychologist Shoshana Zuboff, a social psychologist from Harvard. She wrote the book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. It's a very thick book. It's really worth the effort of reading it. And in the book, she has this very interesting diagram that you see here on the right side. And she just says how platforms create these prediction products that are sold in behavioral futures markets. What does she mean? If you look at the picture here at the bottom, you have a lot of behavioral data that this platform is collecting and is using for internal purposes, for improving their products and whatever. But then there's a whole huge surplus of this data at the top, a huge amount of surplus, which they do not just sell the data to other companies because that's too valuable. What they do is they package this data into prediction products. And if you remember the example that I showed you earlier of Google creating these prediction products that they're selling to advertisers, that's an example. And then they sell these prediction products. Okay, so I was reading this book and I'm thinking in a statistician, predictive person type of mode. And first of all, the first thing that came to my mind, since I lived in Bhutan for a while and in India was, wow, this really reminds me of this kind of a wheel of Dharma, if you've ever seen this before. But going a little forward, the idea here is that if you have better predictions, you have a more valuable prediction product, right? So it's worth more on the market. If I'm Facebook or if I'm Google and I'm trying to sell my prediction products and I'm competing against other platforms, the better my predictions, I can compete better and I can value my products better. So I said to myself, okay, well, what can they do about it? Well, we know all the traditional things that they're doing. They can improve their modeling and their methods. They can get better data. They can build more infrastructure. They're already doing that. But then all of a sudden, something daunted on me. And I said, hold on. The internet platform can actually use their behavior modification. They can take their modification capability and push users' behaviors towards their predictions because they're also doing the predictions. Now, before you start processing this too much, let me give you 3 imaginary scenarios. Scenario number 1, suppose there's a political consulting firm that wants to reach out to people who are likely to vote for some candidates. And suppose that a platform wants to sell predicted vote for A scores. So how does the platform show its predictive capability? It's going to do 2 things. First, it's going to generate a bunch of vote for A scores for a bunch of their users. And then they're going to use behavior modification and push those users' behaviors towards the scores. So the result is that the platform will turn these voting predictions into voting realities. If someone gets a probability that's high for voting for A, then the platform will do everything it can to push that user towards voting to A. How can you do that? Well, you can share different kinds of ads and news and befriend people and send friend recommendations. You can do all kinds of things that will lead you to do to vote in a certain way. Here's a second imaginary scenario. Suppose now we have an insurance company, and the insurance company wants to acquire new customers, but they really want to avoid high-risk ones. So they're going to go to a platform, and the platform is going to try and sell them predicted risk scores. How is the platform going to show their predictive power? They'll take a bunch of users, they'll generate risk scores, predicted use scores, and then they'll push users towards their predicted scores. So if someone is predicted to be high risk, then the platform can do all kinds of things to make them behave more riskier. For example, I can engage you on the app while you're driving because I know when you're driving. I can promote all kinds of alcoholic drinks at inappropriate times. I can do all kinds of things that will promote you to do risky things. So at the end, you get the same result here, where basically the platform makes these high-risk users into high-risk realities. Last imaginary scenario. I'm saying imaginary, so nobody can sue me, but you can think in your head whether this makes sense or not. Imaginary scenario number 3. So now we're talking about, a government who wants to identify high-risk COVID spreaders, who are people who are likely to visit risky locations. And they go to a platform, and it's not unheard of governments working with platforms recently. And the platform wants to sell them predicted risk scores. So how's the platform going to do this? Take a bunch of users, generate risk scores based on all the data that they have about where these people are going, who they're meeting, what they're doing, what they're saying. And then they're going to push these users' behaviors towards their scores. So now you're turning high-risk scores into high-risk realities again. 3 scenarios. In short, the strategy is like this. The platform improves their prediction using 2 steps. Step 1, you generate predictions using your behavioral big data, just the normal way that we would think they would generate those predictions. But step 2 that follows this is the trickier part, and that's the one where they actually push the user's outcome towards the predicted value, because now I actually know the predicted value. I showed you before what was the data mining or statistical or predictive approach to improving prediction, but now let me show you how a behavior modification person would think about this. So the behavior modification person thinks about the user's mental state, and they need to modify the user's mental state. So the behavior modification approach takes and designs the platform to manipulate its behavior so that it affects the user's mental state, which in turn pushes the user's observed behavior towards its predicted behavior. And you end up with very small and nice prediction errors. So it looks like you've predicted really well. Give me your RMSE, and I think that you've done a great job. Now, some of you are probably pondering, why would a platform do this? So I was also wondering, and I've tried to read literatures in all kinds of areas that look at platform behavior, and I found some interesting results. So first of all, in media studies, there's a book by a famous media theorist called Douglas Rushkoff called Team Human. And in it, he writes, the better the platform does at making Mary conform to her algorithmically determined destiny, the more the platform can boast both its predictive accuracy and its ability to induce behavioral change. In a totally different area, I went and found an interesting book by a professor of law, Frank Pascal at University of Maryland. He wrote a book called The Black Box Society. And in an interview at The Intercept, he said the following: Facebook's behavioral prediction work is eerie, and he worries how the company could turn algorithmic predictions into self-fulfilling prophecies, since once they've made this prediction, they have a financial interest in making it true. Third, if you look at the computer science field, a very famous computer scientist, Stuart Russell at Berkeley, has written an interesting book called Human Compatible that talks about AI. It's a very, all these books are highly recommended. And what he says there is that content selection algorithms on social media are designed to maximize click-through. The solution is simply to present items that the user likes to click on, right? Wrong. The solution is to change the user's preferences so that they become more predictable. So the bottom line is that the platform has financial incentive, and also we know it has the technical capability to do it. So then people say, but come on, do you think platforms are really doing this? Do you think Mark Zuckerberg is sitting up there and saying, let's do behavior prediction? Well, here's the answer. I don't really have evidence. I don't work inside a platform, but I think that this really might be happening inadvertently because of how algorithms are being used now on platforms. Specifically, platforms are now using something called reinforcement learning that combines both prediction and behavior modification. If you know a little bit of machine learning, we have supervised learning and we have unsupervised learning, but then there's this third paradigm called reinforcement learning. Whereas the supervised and unsupervised just use passive data that you collected. In reinforcement learning, you collect data and then do something and then collect the feedback. So you have a whole feedback loop that's happening right there. One approach that you might have heard of is called multi-armed bandits, and now they use something called contextual multi-armed bandits, where the idea is that you have a user that's considered the environment, and you have the algorithm that's trying to explore and exploit and figure out what that user, what will make them click or stay or whatever you're trying to achieve. And this kind of setup combines two things. It has experimentation, that's the part of the explore, exploit part, the experimentation, and also predictive modeling in terms of a machine learning model. If you search online for different platforms and see whether and search multi-armed bandits or contextual multi-armed bandits, you'll find quite a few interesting things. Here's a slide I stole off from Netflix. They left it online, and they show that when they use contextual bandits, then their performance is much better in terms of keeping you longer on their site, watching more videos. You know how Netflix is today, right? They start showing you the movies as you just finished and whatever. There's now also something even more potent, which is called deep reinforcement learning, which not only does a one step and collect your feedback, but it keeps doing multi-steps. It's a whole sequence of pushing you and seeing what happens, and pushing you here and seeing what happens and learning you. And it came originally from these agents that were supposed to learn how to play games like chess and Go. So that was the environment. But now the environment is a person, is the user, and the agent is trying through these Markov chains to learn and figure out what to do. It has a set of rewards and it has states. Because a user is too complex to build a model for, like a chess, if it's a chess or a physics phenomenon, it's too complex. What they do is they put in a big deep learning model on top of that to try and figure out the predictions of the reinforcement learning. So at the end of the day, if you go to any of the latest data mining conferences, you'll see examples of people from the big companies displaying how they're using these kinds of reinforcement learning to this example here is serving news articles to a user. If you want to get a feel of what reinforcement learning is like, I don't know how many of you have watched The Social Dilemma. It's available on Netflix. It's a pretty nice way to understand how things are working behind the scenes. I'm going to show a very short clip from there where the idea was the following. There's a boy there where his mother is challenging him to get off his phone for a certain amount of time. And he says, sure, I'm going to do it. And now at the other side, you have the social media that's trying to attract and pull him back in by trying to do everything they can do to get his attention. So the snippet I'll show you starts with a little saying by someone that has worked at Facebook. And let me just show it to you. Okay, so that was just a little piece showing what's happening behind the scenes. Of course, everything is algorithmic, but that really is what is happening behind the scenes and nobody has control over it. So now let's assume that this might be happening behind the scenes. And then if the platform is really using this improved prediction strategy, then there's a bunch of questions that arise. I'm going to raise a few of them. One is, can the behavior modification mask poor predictions? Maybe the platform is really poor at doing predictions, but they can mask it. Another question is, can the customers, meaning the businesses that buy these products, these prediction products, can they infer the real predictive performance if I only report to them the manipulated predictive performance? A third question is, a lot of these customers do routine A/B testing on the platform. So can this routine A/B testing detect this devious scheme? And then the fourth question is what is the role of personalization? We keep hearing personalization all the time. And this is going to turn out to be very interesting. So I wanted to answer these questions, but to answer these questions, I needed a language to represent this new scenario of prediction and manipulation. What typically we like to do in statistics and in machine learning is to use something called the expected prediction error. Oops, sorry. So I wanted to derive the expected prediction error under this manipulation. The problem is that in order to write a formula, we don't typically like writing things like expected value of manipulated y minus y hat. That doesn't kind of work. I can't really work with that. I had a problem because I couldn't find any vocabulary that would work for me. We have great notation for predictive relationships. And then in a separate kind of field, we have great notation for causal relationships. So if you want to do anything like Pearl's counterfactuals, or Rubin's counterfactuals, or Pearl's causal DAGs, or whatever, you have that. But if you want to do prediction, you have all the machine learning and we have all the statistical notations, but there's no real notation that goes together. And that was the problem that I was encountering. Someone recently asked me, why don't you use an econometric approach? Why don't you build a structural equations model? I said, okay, well, what are the two equations? I started building the first equation. It's like, okay, all right. What do you even put into equation 2? And actually, I don't even need this approach because I'm not trying to estimate a causal effect. That's not really what I'm interested in. So I'm really in a new kind of land where I need to describe a scenario with language that is not designed for this kind of combination. So here's what I did. I started with just the standard predictive notation. When there's no manipulation, I have y, the behavior that's being predicted or manipulated, given x. And I'm going to write that just as a function of x with some epsilon, and assume epsilon has some noise 0 and some variance sigma square. And then I'm going to estimate this f. That will be my predictive model. And my predicted scores will just be f hat of x. Now, I want to also represent my manipulation. So what I did here was I borrowed from Judea Pearl his very beautiful operator called the do operator. And what the do operator does is it tells you that the variable that's inside the brackets of those do is something that you can manipulate or intervene on, as opposed to something that doesn't have the do, which is something that you can observe. So it's an observed variable versus a variable that you can intervene on. And what I'm actually interested in is I'm interested in y given do, the behavior of the platform, right? Manipulating the platform behavior b, and all the user profile information x that I observe. And I can write this as just a function g, it doesn't even have to be the same as f, of do of b and x. And to just make this a little shorter, I'm using a y tilde. So y tilde is the manipulated outcome. And you can see that it has a function here of g and of epsilon tilde, which is also manipulated. And epsilon tilde is going to be pretty interesting. So again, I'm going to assume epsilon tilde has a variance of sigma squared tilde, means suppose it's 0. And now I can say, great, I'll combine this. So now the quantity of interest is y tilde minus y hat, right? This is the manipulated behavior minus the prediction. And let me go and try and analyze how to break down this into its components. If you remember the image I showed you earlier on, then y tilde is this green behavior that I pushed, and do of b is right here. Notice that I am manipulating not y, it's not do of y. I'm manipulating something on the platform, so there's a mediation here that will then push the user's behavior towards the y hat. Okay. The formula at the top here is the classic bias variance trade-off, the expected prediction error formula from statistics or machine learning, highly useful. I didn't invent anything here. This is the typical one. What I did in my work was I derived the same formula under manipulation. So now you see instead of y, I have a y tilde. And what turns out to happen here is pretty interesting. On the right side, I have the same variance. That's just the noise. And we know that that's affected by sample size. So ideally, if you're a platform and you want to improve the predictive power and right, minimize this EPE tilde, bigger samples, more data makes your predictions better. Nothing new there. The new interesting part is, first of all, here. You notice that in addition to the bias, I have this little thing here called Kate. And Kate is the conditional average treatment effect, or in this case, the conditional average behavior modification effect for someone with a profile of X. So if you take all the people who have profile X and you do a behavior modification, this is going to be the average behavior modification magnitude. And you'll notice that this can actually counter the bias. If Kate is equal to minus bias, then it totally zeroes it out. And this is beautiful. But you don't actually need to zero it out. As long as it has the opposite sign and it's kind of in that range, you've really shrunk down that piece that used to be called bias. A third piece that's very sneaky and interesting here is this sigma tilde square. And that's usually something that people don't think that you can intervene on. But what happens here is that the behavior modification, remember, it enhances certainty. It can also enhance certainty by affecting this variability. So ideally, if you have very smart modification, you can make people more homogeneous. Let me show you visually what that means. So for example, suppose we're looking at some kind of a food delivery driver's risk scores, right? We all know how risky these folks are. So a very simple model. I have the trip distance on the x-axis, and I have the risk on the y-axis, and maybe we'll measure that by how long they spend on the app. So basically, the longer they drive, the risk is going to go, it's going to be higher because they're probably spending more time on the app. Suppose f of x is the true function. I don't know it, but suppose that this is the true function. These little circles here are different drivers. So we could see that for short distance, we have a bunch of different drivers with different risk levels. And for medium distance, also I have some kind of a spread. And for long distance, I have some spread. Now, suppose I'm building a model. So here's my prediction model. Suppose I don't know the real model. So I'm going to build just a linear line. Suppose I have unlimited data, so we'll keep it simple. I see that my predictive model is pretty good for short distance drivers, because on average, my risk prediction is kind of in the middle. But for medium distance, my predictions are too high. And that's what I call a negative bias. And for long distance, my prediction, these little X's here, are too low. So my behavior modification here would be to not touch the short distance drivers, but to actually push the medium distance drivers up, make them a little more risky, keep them on your app, send them all to all kinds of places, and take the long distance drivers and push their risk a little bit lower. And now my model looks so much better. This is only playing with a bias. That's that Kate thing that I showed you before. But if you have a really smart behavior modification, and if it's really personalized and working well, you can do even better. You can also shrink these dots. So now you're not only pushing things up or down, but you're also shrinking them towards your prediction. And this is the effect of that sigma hat tilde that I showed you before. So with this formula, what's interesting is that you can answer all these questions that I was asking before. So number one was, can behavior modification mask poor predictions? And the answer is absolutely. We saw in this new EPE tilde, sorry, a tilde is missing here, an EPE tilde formula, that we can use this bias here to very nicely mask how well you're predicting. The second question was, if I only give the customers who buy my predictions, I only give them the manipulated RMSE, okay, their predictive power, can they reverse engineer and figure out what was the original one? And if you look at the two formulas without and with manipulation, you'll notice that there are too many things here that they would have to estimate. Some of them are nearly impossible to estimate. Things like, bias are extremely hard to estimate. And of course, Kate might be able to estimate if you are the platform itself, and you would have to estimate it separately for every possible profile X. So I think it's very unlikely that the customer can reverse engineer and figure out what would have been the predictive behavior had the platform not used the behavior modification. A third question is, many of these customers run routine A/B testing on the same platform. Could they figure it out? The bad news is no, because when you're randomizing it according to whatever you're interested in, you've just made all my behavior modification look equal for groups A and group B. So there's going to be no difference between them. You're not going to see that. It's masked by your own randomization. And the fourth question was, what is the role of personalization? And the interesting answer here is that it has a dual role. First of all, You can personalize the predictions, right? The first step is you actually generate predictions using the behavioral big data. And the better your prediction is, then the less modification you will actually need. So it is worth investing in all the standard approaches for making our predictions better. But you can also cover up. So if you use personalization at the behavior modification step, and you can do all kinds of things to personalize. You don't only need to personalize the content, you can even personalize the design. You can personalize the reinforcement type. So some people will be more affected by time pressure, and other ones, when you tell them 5 of your friends have just purchased this, or 3 more hotels are in that pool. So you can actually personalize a lot of these different things in order to improve your prediction. So personalization plays a double role. And I'll remind you, this is what Stuart Russell was saying: change the user's preferences so that they can become more predictable. Now, if we're worried about the business customers being tricked, then I hope we also remember the end data subjects here, who are typically us. And of course, this raises a lot of moral concerns. Behavior modification in general is very problematic. It started out with a good intention from psychology for improving human life and society. But now, if you're using this in this combination of predict and modification, then we're making users conform to algorithmically determined destinies without our knowledge or consent. And optimizing the platform's commercial interest is going to be at odds many times with well-being. I showed you, platforms pushing users to becoming more risky. The only cool part here is that a statistical approach can uncover these implications. And I think that's a very interesting point. So let me just conclude. Internet platforms now combine a dual power. They can predict and they can modify behaviors. And this is new. The imaginary scenarios that I showed you, you can decide if they're imaginary or not, but they are potentially not imaginary. The approach that I showed you, I could not find it anywhere in the statistics or the machine learning literature, most likely because prediction lives in one part of our world, and design of experiments and interventions lives in a different part of the world, and they even have different notations, so that when I tried to put things together, I had trouble, and I needed to introduce technical vocabulary that will bring them together. I chose to use Perl's do operator. Perhaps there are other ways to do this, but I found the do operator to be a very elegant and very clear way of conveying what is going on. This combination of vocabularies, I think, is going to be useful beyond this scenario that I'm showing you here of platforms combining prediction and behavior modification. There are other kinds of strategies that are used in the world. For example, uplift modeling, if you're in marketing, that's very popular, where you predict and manipulate. So if you have in mind any kind of these combinations, I think this vocabulary might be useful to you for describing it. And finally, I've shown you that this kind of strategy has serious implication, both for the platform customers who buy predictions and actually can be very tricked, as well as for users or the data subjects whose data is being predicted and manipulated. So I'll stop here and hope to have interesting questions and discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Galit, for a very nice and thought-provoking talk. I think you made a very, very good point here, and I'm sure all the attendees would agree with me with that. That was very clear, and that was a very good message. So now is the time for questions. So you're all welcome to put questions in the Q&A, or you're welcome also to raise your hands, obviously, and we'll give you the word. I will start with one question that appeared in the Q&A, and you kind of went there on and off, and a bit more towards the end of your talk. But someone, so Valentin Zelenyuk, asked a question, and he said maybe you should have been more clear earlier on. Another important question is whether it is ethical or not, all these behavior modifications. And I think maybe you can develop a bit more what you were saying towards your second last slide.
Okay, so whether it's ethical to manipulate people's behavior, the platforms did not invent this. Think of marketing, the whole field of marketing, the whole field of advertising. There's so many industries, age-old industries that have been doing this for a long time. Our behavior is manipulated all the time. But what's new here is that it's at a massive rate on these technologies that have very strong networked effects that were not there before. We cannot even learn about what's going on behind the scenes. And that's why there's more and more regulation happening, especially coming out of Europe with the GDPR and now the new AI initiative. There is more and more regulation beginning to look at these kinds of issues. Ethical, legal, these are all excellent questions. And I agree that these are questions that, I mean, for me, it feels very uncomfortable, but you have to also stay kind of open-minded as a scientist, because if I just dismiss all this and say, it's unethical, I don't want to look at this, then I've actually lost the opportunity to identify what it's doing. So that's why I try to show you what's happening, to alarm you just a little bit, but not to alarm you too much, so that you can still kind of use the derivations and the useful information that we can get out of it.
Yeah. So thanks very much for this answer. I totally agree with what you say. I think we have to accept that it is happening. And then us as scientists, it's our role somehow to understand, you know, what's going on, what is hopeless, as you were saying, maybe to estimate and I'd say assess, and what we could actually do maybe to be more transparent and better in the future. It could be policymakers, it could be scientists, it could be many type of people who act on this kind of new knowledge you could bring for us. So thanks a lot for that. We have another question by Nikki Kamp saying, thanks a lot for the interesting presentation. I'm not the only one to find it very interesting. Is there maybe a limit to personalization, in example, in terms of computational complexity? The more users the platform has, the more personalized measures must be undertaken and identified, especially when we think about real-time personalization. So what do you think about that?
Well, it's definitely computationally expensive, no question about that. But if you attend some of the conferences of machine learning people or look online at some of the papers, there are a lot of papers on arXiv that the platform people who have time to write stuff will put out there. You'll see they're using these reinforcement learnings exactly for this reason. They basically use, instead of developing heavy modeling or causal, they just put a machine learning tool on top of it that just engages you in the cheapest possible way, you know, nudge you this way, nudge you that way, you put a reward. It's based on Markov chains, so it's cheap, right? They use the best ways to be able to scale it up. And that's why it's actually scaling up. Now, in many cases, it does, because of these hacks and these shortcuts, it does unintended things. So unless you tell it how to do what you want it to reach, you just say, just get to this endpoint and figure your way out by trial and error kind of thing, then the algorithms do all kinds of unintended things. So I think that with this effort to reduce computational complexity and to be able to scale this massively, that's why they're using machine learning, and that's where the dangers lie.
Yeah. So very, very nice answer. I totally see your point. Now I see two questions by Ben Samuts and Robert Fildes. I think we could actually merge these two questions. I see them going in the same direction. So Ben starts by saying, is it possible platforms are continuing the manipulation once they sell the prediction? And that links to the question by Robert, in the sense that if you do that, eventually it affects your own data, the data set you could use as a basis for updating your model, forecasting, etc. So do you see there could be this self-negating effect that eventually, if they do it too much, it's also going to affect their raw material they use for prediction and manipulation?
Okay, so this is a really good question. If there was only one thing that they were predicting forever, then this thing would be affected all the time. But if you think about selling a prediction product right now to this insurance company, I won't necessarily continue manipulating those people in the same way later on. Why would I want to do that? So I might be manipulating something else later on or predicting something else. So I personally think that they're not going to be sticking to one specific thing, but the prediction products will guide what they need to predict in order to sell the product, but then afterwards, not necessarily. And you're asking great questions. I think this combination of things where what you're predicting, what the platform is doing, the modification the platform is doing, sometimes it's in line with what the the customer wants, right? If you're pushing me towards purchasing something and that's what the customer wants, you'll say, oh, what's the problem then, right? No problem. The problem arises more when you're predicting risk, because usually the customer is not interested in making things more risky. So that's when things become a little troublesome. And also, again, I think that the key in this story is that there's this two-step. First, you make your prediction, and then you push the user. The minute you start bringing a prediction afterwards and user, and then it's kind of a different story. So these are all great questions.
Which, by the way, a short comment on my side, then regarding your notation, you just said it yourself. For me, the right notation is do of B given Y hat, right? Because as you said, it's based on your forecast that you're going to do the do of B. So talking about notation, I don't know if it's a good suggestion or not, but at least in the message, I agree with you. It's given Y hat, the do of B. All right.
Yes, that's great. That's a great comment. Thank you.
No problem. So Nikos Koantzes wanted to add to Robert's comment that GDPR will precisely mask this diversity, and that usage statistics demonstrate that there is a dent to data collection in Europe. So I think it was more of a comment than a question, and that builds on what we were just saying. Okay, and another question, very interesting, that you started discussing that in your slide. Maybe you can develop a bit more. A question by C.K. Leong. Since Kate of X is difficult to estimate without access to the platform data, how can such manipulation be uncovered?
That's the million-dollar question, and that's, that's the problem that I'm facing with convincing editors of management journals to believe me. They say, do you have evidence that it happens? It's really hard. It's really hard to convince them that it's happening. I mean, I think the fact that it can happen is already sufficient. If a platform has the ability to do it, then they should not have the ability to do it, because we see what could be the consequences. Even if someone is not malicious, the minute you put machine learning together in this whole system, and like I showed you in the video, even the data scientists don't know what's going on behind the hood, then you have to sort of say, this is too dangerous, we can't do it. Even if they're not doing it, how can we find if it's happening or not? How can you find if it's actually happening or not? I guess the only way is to go into the platform, turn off their behavior modification for a day, and then compare it to the non, but go find a friend that will do that for you.
Wouldn't it be possible to cast that in a learning in games kind of environment and say it's a game of the platform versus, I don't know, a population? We define an action space for the platform potentially. And then again, your null, you can define a null maybe, and say, we have to reject the null, which is that the platform didn't act based on the information and the way the game was defined, right? Do you see what I mean now?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm thinking about it in terms of like a counterfactual, just basically tell me what would have happened if they turned it off. But I guess you're thinking of it, you're formulating it in a slightly more game theory way. But I think at the end of the day, you just need to have a counterfactual. And the EPE manipulated and the EPE non-manipulated basically shows you what would happen with and without. So if you turn it off and you get the same number for your EPE, then you know that nothing is being manipulated. It's kind of is right. That's the answer.
Otherwise, it's an even smarter manipulation that you've made your manipulation in a way that you couldn't be detected, right?
Well, I mean, I think if people are becoming more predictable, just like Stuart Russell was saying, if people are becoming more and more predictable, if you feel yourself becoming more predictable, right? You used to do things in different ways and all of a sudden you keep doing things in the same way. That's kind of a trigger. And I think someone in the questions before was saying that indeed the GDPR is making us more predictable because it's removing the options for the companies to do some things. That's an interesting thought I didn't think about.
Yeah, very nice. Another question by Ben Samet. Further question: if platforms don't keep pushing the users towards the prediction, won't companies realize the predictions were off? Then the company would stop using the product.
Absolutely. And in fact, if you look online, there's some really big companies, I think it's P&G is one of them, if I remember correctly, that figured out a few years ago that all the money that they're investing in advertisements on Facebook was actually more spending than what they were making, and they just cut it and figured out that they're making more money. Now, maybe prediction products have gotten better today, but definitely this is something that some companies notice, and their way to figure it out is to go offline. Now, related to this, I'll just mention one thing. There are different ways that these predictions might end up in the hands of the customer. One is that they just get the predictions, but they keep working with the platform. The other one is if you think about a police force or a mental health group organization, maybe they actually want to get some kind of a predictive model out of it. So, you know, they kind of say, okay, we're going to buy your predictive model. We're going to give you new people and just give us predictions. So then once they stop the manipulation, once they give them people who are not maybe even on the platform, the predictions will look terrible, will be absolutely terrible. So they might find out if they do that. But yeah, I think they're going to find out eventually.
That's a very, very good point. I don't see more questions for the Q&A. So then maybe I have time for final question here. It's very nice, this concept of combining the two, this prediction plus manipulation. But somehow, based on your talk, it sounds like we believe there is no limit to how much we could manipulate, right? Don't we think, let's say if your potential to manipulate would be very small, you would not affect much the prediction. If your potential to manipulate is infinite, you could get perfect predictions all the time, right? So do we have an idea, or could we also try to see somehow how much it would be possible to manipulate?
I think that is actually, again, in that you get that again through the sigma tilde square, through like the predictability part, and the Kate. So the Kate is like an average thing, right? But the limit of how much you can personalize, I agree. I mean, of course, if you could personalize to death in the behavior modification, then you would go all the way to prediction. But then things, yeah, that would be kind of interesting, how much you're able to manipulate people. There's also an issue of time. So how long you have to engage the person to get to do that behavior. So I think that will add limitations. There will be different things that do limit your ability to do behavior modification, but I feel that it's actually pretty strong, because also the behaviors that they're trying to modify are behaviors that we're very regular on them. So if they're able to change us even a little bit, we keep doing that, and we'll kind of reinforce ourselves towards that area. But I think that question is great, is like, how far can you go? How far do you need your reinforcement learning to go before you stop and say, okay, that's it, I'm done?
Great, and a bit scary as you talk. So thank you very much once again, Galit. I see the time. We're reaching the end of the session. It was really nice to hear this point of view, and thank you all for also this interaction through the question session. I think we've all learned a lot today, so we can continue safely with other sessions for today. And please remember that there is the closing session in quite a few hours. I think it's in 6 hours from now. So that would be nice if everybody can attend also there. So thank you once again to all, especially to Galit Shmueli, and see you later. Thank you.